Hi everyone, welcome to today's National Teen Book Club broadcast. We're so glad to have you joining us today. So sorry for the delay. We had a few technical issues on our end, but we're here now and ready to start. So this Q&A will last around 45 minutes. We'll start with a quick introduction to our guest speaker and then move on to the Q&A.
Joining us today is author Patrice Lawrence. Patrice grew up in Sussex with a mother who loved historical fiction. She writes books for children and young people of all ages, from picture books to teen thrillers, and was awarded an MBE for literature in 2021. Patrice has been shortlisted for and won many literary awards, and she is passionate about social justice and is also an ambassador for the creative writing charity First Story.
So Patrice is, of course, the author of our hero read, Jane Eyre, Abridged for young readers, and this is our final session for her retelling of the original Gothic classic by Charlotte Brontë. We love this review from the bookseller, as we absolutely agree. Although the story is abridged, all the passion and drama of Bronte's original remains a triumph. Hopefully you feel the same. And if you're not reading or familiar with Jane Eyre, this session will give you a little glimpse into the story, but you can shape the discussion with your questions about Patrice's own reading habits, her book recommendations, as well as her career to date.
Yes, you can submit questions via the Q&A Slido function underneath the stream on your screen, or you can submit them via the QR code on screen or by typing in the code online. The Q&A function will be open throughout the discussion, so you can join in at any time. And if you're experiencing any issues with the stream, please let us know there, and we will try our best to support you.
Hi, Patrice. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. So let's get started on our Q&A. We've already got loads of questions from schools. Our first question, so can you tell us a bit more about Jane Eyre Abridged, please? For those who haven't started reading it yet, or for those who are studying as well.
I suppose I've got, and it's not a great thing to say, but I've kind of got this thing about you're told what a classic books are, so that makes me not want to read them. It's like when everybody's telling you these are the books that you should read or the films that you should see. I think, no, I don't want to do that. But Jane Eyre's always been part of my life, I think, because when I was growing up, there was lots of adaptations on TV. And my mum was born in Trinidad in the Caribbean, which was a colonial island. So they're brought up doing English exams, English literature, and she absolutely loves those sort of historical books. So she loved Jane Eyre. And I actually can't remember reading it properly until my early 20s. I don't know if I'd read it before. Maybe I'd just seen so many adaptations, I thought I'd read it before. And I just remember falling in love with it then. And when we got the chance to sort of abridge a book for Walker, there was quite a lot of classic books. And I chose Jane Eyre for quite pragmatic reasons, in that I was researching the 18th century, just slightly before the Jane Eyre period, but I thought that would give me a sense. And I just fell in love with it all over again. I thought Jane herself is an absolutely amazing heroine. And it's one of those books where, you cry, you're rooting for her, and you just can't help admiring her as a hero.
Thank you. We've actually got so many coming in, and do get your questions in early if you have to leave on time. We will run a little bit over, just to apologise for starting late. So another question from a school. Do you intend to adapt any other classics, Bronte's or otherwise?
It depends if anybody asks me, actually. Do you know what? It's also quite a good way to get me to read the books that I haven't read. I remember when I was kind of in my early teens trying to read The Three Musketeers and just not getting on with it at all. I read Wuthering Heights and disliked it immensely because everybody's so horrible in it, I think. But I think, to be able to adapt books would enable me to reread them and rethink. And in the years between reading the Jane Eyre both times, I suppose I've changed as a person. It's made me look at Jane Eyre in a different way. So if there was an opportunity, I think, just because I'm quite nerdy as well, so be able to really read books, really work out the politics of that time, why people are written as they are, all of those things. I absolutely adore doing that. So to break a book down by rewriting it is actually quite a pleasure for me.
Obviously, it's your own book, so I guess it might be a bit of a biased answer, but do you recommend that readers try the unabridged novel or the abridged novel first? What would you say?
It depends on how much if you're into reading really long books or not. I think the original Jane Eyre, there's quite a lot of debate about the nature of God and good and evil, and I personally find this bit a little bit boring because they're just not my thing, I think. And also, I suppose when I reread Jane Eyre, I read it with, in a sense, a kind of not contemporary eye, but thinking about all the way that Mr. Rochester behaved. When I first read it, maybe because of all the BBC adaptations, I saw Mr. Rochester as this tragic hero who's just waiting for the right woman to save him. I had discovered feminism, yeah. And then, rereading it and realising very explicitly that he got his money through the enslavement of Africans in a plantation. He married a widow, had a plantation, that he kept his Caribbean, born wife locked in the attic, that, pretended she didn't exist, and all of those. I thought, this man is terrible. It's so terrible. So I think my opinions of him, which I think actually quite valid, probably show more in the adaptation, but I think that will reflect most of our contemporary views as well, and also around mental ill health and the way women are treated as well. I tried not to change the language because the language is actually really, really beautiful in the original Jane Eyre. The language of landscape and buildings and even emotions are fantastic, but some of the perspectives on race and gender relations, women and mental health were things that I found very difficult and didn't think I could replicate those views. So I would actually suggest reading both if you can, and then because it just gives you those different perspectives.
Yes, I think that's a fair point. Hopefully that answers the question from one of our schools. What did you add or change from the original text, and why? Is there something you changed that you felt was really important, and why? So slightly more specific question here, which may mean nothing to some people on the call, so don't worry too much about that. But is the ghost of Jane's uncle symbolic of anything? And if so, what?
I actually can't remember the ghost of Jane's uncle.
It's kind of linked to a separate question then. How did you decide which parts of the Red Room description to keep or change? So my memory of this...
Oh, the what at the beginning? Yeah. Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah, she's worried. Yeah. She's afraid to be locked in the Red Room with...
Yeah. I don't know. I think there's a lot of ghosts around those time. I mean, as a writer, I would think as a writer, it's her way of seeding the ghost, the uncle, so we know he exists, and of course later we know that he was actually trying to be a good man, and that when he died, But I just think that opening chapter of the book itself, of the Jane Eyre, of having this child in this room and the way it's described, the furniture and the colour, is absolutely stunning, I think. And perhaps I shouldn't say this, but when I read the original one, I think I enjoyed the bits when she was a child more, when she's, with her terrible auntie, and then in this sort of residential children's home orphanage. I enjoyed those more. So the way that, children are written, and their fears and their friendships and their concerns are really quite stunning. And in terms of what I changed, I think, go back to that previous question, there was not much to change from those. It was just adapting the language. But what I did change was very much the language that was used to describe Bertha, Mr. Rochester's first wife. The language that's used in the book kind of always makes her resembles an animal, and sort of wild and unkempt. And actually, we know this is a woman who's been taken from where she lives and locked in an attic. And so I made the language to describe her much more sympathetic, I think, because she's been treated incredibly badly. But it's a ghost symbolic. I don't know, because I'm looking at it as a writer, as someone who's like, I need to get this character in, so he's going to ghost because he's important later.
Thank you, Patrice. And we have some questions, not specifically about Jane Eyre, but more about your career, I guess, and your other books. So this is from Or2 Hassenbrook Academy. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Oh, everywhere. Honestly, my head is just full of things all the time. When I lived in London, I spent a lot of time, when I was writing for older teenagers, I'd spend just a lot of time on buses because they were cheap, and listening to sort of conversations. And I'm always thinking, like, why? I was that child at school who would always go like, why? It doesn't actually make you any more popular as an adult, to be honest. But my head has always been full of questions. So the book that I was researching when I was also writing Jane Eyre is a series of 18th century magical fantasies set in London. And I imagine them, they were inspired by the film Inception, where you've got dreams within dreams within dreams. So what if there was an enchanted dream, sleep that came over London? And also there's a series of adult books called The Rivers of London, which are contemporary, kind of crime procedurals, but they've also got kind of like urban magic in them. So they've got sort of river princesses, but they're Nigerian party girls, and so I thought, what if it's also very grounded in London's history? And again, that's my nerdiness, So, what if, the film Inception met the rivers of London in 18th century London with 13-year-olds? So there's always quite often popular culture. Absolutely love popular culture, items of news. So when I wrote Indigo Donut, I was very angry about the way foster children were treated. So I wanted to think about that, and something else inspired something else. There's always usually these ingredients being mixed around, and lots of what ifs, and whys.
You've touched on Jane Eyre as a child, those fears of childhood, and how well they're depicted in the book and in your retelling. We have a question from a school. Do you prefer to write for older or younger children?
Oh, it doesn't matter to me, actually. There's no preference, really. I think it's what is the particular story I want to tell. I think so. Some of the I suppose partly the teenage books I wrote, so my own child was a teenager, and it would get to the point where they'd say to me, like, Mom, I'm going to tell you something, but don't put it in a book. It's like, because there was just so many things that were interesting about their lives and their friends' lives that I wanted to take. I'm incredibly passionate about social justice and equality, so that sort of cuts through all of my books, through my picture books, through to sort of primary school age to teenage books. So I think that is the thing that cuts through. So for me, it's what is the thing that I want to think about? What do I want to change? What discussions do I want to create? So one of the quite often in schools get asked, what's my favorite book that I've written, and it's actually a picture book called Is That Your Mama? And which is illustrated by Diane Ewing, and it's inspired by the fact that I have a mixed heritage child. When we're in London, because their skin is much fairer than mine, would often be stopped and asked, is that your mum? Is that your child? And children live in lots of different types of families. They might live in mixed ethnic families. They might live in foster families with grandparents. All of these things. Families aren't standard. They could be anything. But lots of little children do get asked intrusive questions by strangers. And so I wanted a book that actually gave children the power to not answer questions, because quite often we're brought up, aren't we? Got to be polite to adults, But actually, if the ice cream man asks you, is that your mama? You've got no obligation to answer him. So I've got no preferences. Actually, it depends what I want to say and what I want to change, I suppose.
Thank you. And just while you've touched on social justice, your other work or kind of thing that you advocate for is reading for pleasure, of course, and you're joining us today with that aim in mind. Why is being an advocate for that so important to you?
Oh gosh, that's an essay, that is. So I'm currently the Book Trust Writer in Residence, which means every 6 months they choose a writer to champion something that they're passionate about in relation to reading for pleasure. And my sort of what I'm passionate about is reading for pleasure for children facing challenging circumstances. And I think because for myself, I grew, my first 4 years I was privately fostered, which means that when my mum came to England by herself from Trinidad, she was training to be a nurse. And then when she became pregnant with me, she had no family to support her and look after the baby while she continued training. So I was looked after in a foster family from the age of 4 months to sort of 4 years old. Then I went back to live with my mum with my Italian stepdad. So actually, that's why it inspires Is That Your Mama too. I've never lived in a family where we're all the same colour, and I've never lived in a standard family. And I always loved reading. I grew up also as a black child in Sussex, a time when there's lots of very overt racism, both in terms of, what the names people would call you, but in terms of what's on telly, what's in newspapers. And books for me, in some ways, were quite often a big escape for me. They sometimes were quite problematic because all of the books I read had white heroes and mostly heroes. Sometimes it's girls, mostly heroes, were written by white authors. So the downside of that is I never thought that a child like me could be a hero, should be in books, could be a character, or even write a book. And it took me a very, very long time to change that. But on the other hand, what it did is, one book particular, for instance, was Wind in the Willows. And I loved Wind in the Willows because there's a chapter where Mole is feeling a bit homesick. He's had his adventures with Rat, and he wants to show Rat his burrow, but it's probably not as flash as Rat's riverside apartment. And they go to it, and Rat is so empathetic. And I lived in a cul-de-sac with my Italian stepdad and my mum, and they weren't married, which was very rare. Italian and Caribbean household, loud. Great food, loud. And it was like none of my friends. So I used to think that my friends wouldn't want to come and visit this strange household. But what Wind in the Willows taught me is that empathy. If they're your friends, it doesn't matter. And my best friends have been my best friends since I was 5. So I think books can, and also what books can also do is, there are things that might trouble you as a child that you can't articulate, or you might not want to articulate. So for me, it was like why things would happen to me that wouldn't happen to my white friends. And I didn't have the words for it, and I didn't want the words for it because it really hurt. But then I'd read books where a child was an outsider or something like that would happen to them, and I felt less alone. So I think books can help you build that empathy, but they can make you feel that you're not alone sometimes. And I think that's, for me, that's a world that I quite often turned to.
Well, that sort of leads nicely into another question, which I'm going to put 2 together because they might be the same answer or they might be completely different answers. So from one school, we've had who inspired you to write? And from another, we've had who is your favourite author?
I don't know who inspired me to write. I think my foster mum, Auntie Phyllis, taught me to read when I was quite young, before school, and we joined a library in Brighton when I was very little. So I think I was always inspired by stories and writing. So I think I got into the world of stories very young, and I was always encouraged by my foster mum to write. And I had some great teachers at school, particularly secondary school, who encouraged me as well, because it just, I didn't go to school. You had author visits. Well, actually published just as well, because most of the authors I read were dead, and that would not have been great. So it was, it's just not a possibility as a career option to be a writer. So there are people who encouraged me a lot to write. And then when I was, as I say, I always wrote white characters up until my 30s, and I can tell you exactly. It was like 2 weeks before the last 2 weeks of 1999, and I just had a baby, and I turned on the TV, and it was a BBC adaptation of Mary Blackman's Pig Heart Boy, and just turning on the TV, it's like, oh my days, it's like a black family, and they're English, they're not American, and it is about a heart transplant, pig heart transplant, and it's about family and love and morals and all of those things. It was like a door opened for me, and I just thought all the things that made me feel that I didn't belong were the things that gave me the power to be a writer, because I could see so many different perspectives and so many different worlds, but also the stories of black children and black families and working class children and working class families were a valid thing to write about, because that's what I knew about. So that actually changed my perspective of how I wrote and changed my voice as a writer and gave me permission to write about the things that I cared about. In terms of favourite writers, I don't know. It really depends what I'm in a mood for, I think. And also it's a bit weird, as I've met so many children's writers now, so I dare not name any names in case I upset them. But I love reading all different genres. I'm a massive reader. I love Patrick Ness's new kind of graphic novel called The Chronicles of a Lizard Nobody, which are incredibly funny. Because I love Patrick Ness's sort of YA book, so it was a real departure for me, and I just love being made to laugh by the book, which I think is sort of really fantastic. Also read quite a lot of non-fiction now as well, but I'm a sort of reading magpie. I'll try anything.
I love that, thank you. And we've got a question from 5 Acres High School. Are you ever happy or unhappy? That's probably the most prominent thing in this question. Are you ever unhappy with your editors' feedback? How do you handle that kind of criticism?
Oh wow, that's a really good question. I'm trying to phrase, how can I phrase this diplomatically? So actually I had an 1.5-hour conversation with an editor a couple of nights ago, and for an early draft of a middle grade book. And what you do in that draft is you look at the structure of it, and all the things that she mentioned were absolutely right. Because sometimes what I do is I don't write in chronological order. I write the bits that I'm really interested in, the scenes, because when you're writing 80,000 words, it's really hard to sustain it sometimes. So I go for the bits that, oh yeah, I want to write that, I want to write the fight scene, I want to do that. and then I sometimes lose the shape of it. And the things that I forget is what motivates people, why they do what they do. And so with those structural edits, you're talking about, so what is the timeline? You know, what's the motivation? Stuff that I normally find quite boring. So I really need somebody to talk to me, you know, about that. The difficulties can be sometimes is that the characters that I write about and their background are quite often different to editors. So they sometimes don't quite understand, particularly in terms of the way different people use language. So when I was in London, you know, people would say quite often, I'm going shops, I'm going uni, not to the. And so in dialogue, I'd reflect that and I'd come back, the grammar would be corrected. So I had to write a whole essay about colloquialisms and voices and register and things like that. I recently had a debate with an editor because my character would say, me and my brother's birthday, and it should be like my brother and my birthday. Yes, if you're writing a thesis, but not if you're talking. So I think dialogue has quite often been an issue because I, again, grew up in a household, the Trinidadian mum and Italian stepdad. And Angelo speaks English very, very well, but obviously we use language differently in different places, depending on our region, our family background, you know, who we hang out. And in different times as well, we might switch how we talk, depending. And I love that about human beings, but perhaps sometimes editors don't always have those common experiences. So dialogue is usually the one.
Well, we've switched on to your sort of the business of writing there, rather than the process. Auto Hassenbrook Academy would like to know, how did you get published?
Weirdly, when I started writing, it never occurred to me that publishing was an option, which is actually quite a freeing thing. You know, now sometimes on social media, you just see people, oh, I haven't been published, I've written it, and you just think, well, maybe write for joy. It's, you know, there's no guarantee, no matter how well you write, that you'll get published. So the first thing I ever had published was a poem in the sort of local newspaper in Brighton when I was 13. And I still have it in my diary that I take to school sometimes. And I got £1 for that. And I was I don't think I ever spent it. I was so proud. Then I had a couple of secondary school English teachers, Miss Clark and Mr. Jones, who encouraged me to write. So I used to love short stories. So I used to write those, and I think I had a couple read out in a local mid-Sussex kind of literary festival. Then I started tried to write short stories because then, you know, pre-internet was a lot more magazines. So a couple of teen magazines had some short stories published, and I was paid for then. I also used to write just stories and illustrated for my little brothers. I'm much older than my two little brothers as well, because I think I was trying to put them in. And then when I was an adult, I wrote a short story, entered a short story to a competition, and the prize was that you would be published, and it was by Penguin, so it's a, you know, big publisher. And through that, I met my then agent, Caroline Sheldon. So an agent is a person who is a kind of bridge between you and the publishers. So they should know all the editors and all the publishers, and try and place your work with the right person and negotiate the deal. And Caroline Sheldon, my agent, was the agent for Julia Donaldson, with Gruffalo, for John Agard, you know, for quite a few writers. So she was just, yeah, I suppose she changed my life in a way, because she waited and waited and waited until I was ready. So I'd submit work to her, and she'd, not good enough. And I said another 70,000 words. Geez, no, not good enough to be published. And then she'd help me, but she nurtured me and helped me. And eventually, there's a couple of things that published through educational publishing. So, you know, in your schools, you probably had in primary school guided reading books. So if you read that book, you go on to the next one. So I had a couple of those that were set in Trinidad. So that helped me understand how you work with editors, actually, because I've never done this before. Then I went on a crime writing course. I thought, I can't write books for children, teenagers. I'm not very good at it. But I love crime novels. So I went on a crime writing course, and we all had prompts. You had to pull them out of a hat, and you had to hide a prompt in a paragraph, like a clue. My prompt was, he woke up dreaming of yellow. What on earth? That's a bit abstract. It's Apocalypse and the Simpsons, who knows, you know. But I there'd been a teacher strike a couple of weeks before that, and being a really responsible parent, I'd taken my then year 7 child to Hyde Park Winter Wonderland in London. It was so expensive. It was free to get in, but everything was so expensive. And so I was inspired by a sort of crime writing course, a young guy called Marlon, who's 15 or 16, going on a date with a girl, first date, way above his league. They go on a ghost train, come out, and she's dead. And I wrote that simply because it's a crime writing course. And they said that at the beginning, at the end of the chapter, said it's got to be a crime. I thought, oh yeah, killed a girl on a ghost train. And then I just, And I really wanted to know that story. So I eventually ended up writing it. It took a while because I was working full time and had a child. But when I was eventually published, it won some prizes, and that kind of launched me into being a young adult book. And I think the moral for that for me was, I think sometimes publishing likes to follow certain trends, this is in, vampires are in, or romanticy is in, or this, that. But actually mine had nothing to do with that. And I think sometimes children's publishing has very little connection with children and young people. You all are very global. You all have incredibly diverse tastes. You talk to people all around the world about manga or anime or whatever. So, and I think sometimes publishing forgets the diversity of you. And so that book was one that nobody wanted apart from one person. And when it was published, it won the prizes because actually, I think at that time, people wanted a thriller and a girl dying on a ghost train.
Thank you. I think you answered a question that came in anonymously from a school about, did you enjoy writing in English at school? And you kind of touched on your story writing there. So we'll move on to the next one, which is back to Jane Eyre. This is from Waldgate School. When describing Jane, did she remind you of anyone? You did say in the front of your book in the author's note that she's very brave.
In a sense, I think she reminded me of a sense of all people who are really struggling not to be the person they're expected to be. And I think because obviously at that time, she's an orphan, she's a woman, there's no man who can protect her, all of those things. And her easiest option would have been to have the relationship with Mr. Rochester, even though he still had a wife and at least she'd have some money, whatever, and she chooses not to. And that was the bravery, that she would sort of rather walk off into the moor and risk death than be his kind of mistress. So I think for me, it's like anybody who really knows their inner self and decides, actually, I'm going to be who I am in spite of everything that society decides I should be. So that was it. And that's why I wanted to write her like that, because I just think she was incredibly brave, incredibly authentic, incredibly self-aware as well. So I think nobody in particular, just little bits of different people that I know.
You talked at the beginning about seeing Jane Eyre. Obviously, it's been adapted for TV and film so many times. 5 Acres High School are wondering if any of your books have been turned into film adaptation.
Oh, I wish. I think my teenage books are considered too London for that. And we came close with 8 Pieces of Silver. A TV company was interested in that and maybe having like eight sort of episodes, but that kind of died away. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I know authors who've had their books, adapted and have actually made it to a movie. And it's a difficult thing because I think once you hand it over to the production agency, they can do anything with it. So it's a real, do they make it better? Do they not? Does it change? If you do get your book made into a movie, I think you make your money as an author by the amount of extra books that you sell on top of that. What I'd really love actually is my books to be made into plays, because I think with plays you can be really creative with it much more. It gives you much more sort of, I don't know, if one of my books was made into a play, I wouldn't mind how they presented it on a stage. The more creative and interesting, the better. And I think also with a play, you're not looking for the American stars or this or that, the other. If it was a London play, you could use local London young people, all of those things. They're saying that if somebody said, you know what, I'm going to make your book into a film, like, yeah, go ahead. But no, not yet.
And we've got a question from Waldgate School. How do you combat writer's block? You kind of talked about writing the interesting scenes first, but is there anything else that you do?
Oh, lots of things. One, I'm usually writing more than one book at the same time because my boredom threshold is quite low. So I will jump between genres. If I'm really stuck, and there was a bit, for instance, when I was writing Indigo Donut where I got really stuck, it was because I kind of lost. So quite often what I do with my characters when I'm thinking, because I start with characters and I tend to think about three things about them. So what are they afraid of? Because once you've got a fear, you really make them face it when you're a writer. You really throw it at them. Second, I sometimes give them something physical that's precious because you know that's going to get destroyed at some point. So in Orange Boy, it was his Marlon's father's record collection. In Splinter Sunshine, there's a girl called Dee, and she's got a book of wildflowers that her gran gave her. It's usually a present sometimes because those are things that are quite precious to me. So I give them something precious because then I can make a backstory around that and I'll work out why it's precious to them, and that adds to the sort of depth of the story, and then I can take it away. And then I have to give them a goal. So even at the beginning, it might be different, but they have to want something, and that's your motivation. And when I'm stuck, I realize I've forgotten what the character wants. And in the book, when I had a conversation with my editor the day before yesterday, it was actually the villain. What actually does the villain want? Because that would drive the story. So I have to go back and really think. And then I do a lot of mind maps as well. So I'll put the problem in the middle and just do lots of little sort of legs of spiderwebs, thinking just randomly a real information dump, thinking what could they want, what could it be. And then when I go back to writing, I will look at that and use that. So I do, and also I live by the seaside now, so I quite often go for a walk by the seaside as well. But yeah, usually it's because I've kind of lost what the character wants. I'm just floundering around, so I need to go right back to the beginning.
So just for anyone who has to leave us now, thank you so much for your questions. We are going to run through all the questions we've got and make sure we answer them, and then we'll wrap up, which will take us a little bit over our usual time. So thank you for Patrice for saying you can stick around a bit longer. Great question from Walgate School. You might not want to tell us this, but what might be the topic of the next book you write?
Oh, I probably don't know actually. I've got a book coming out in January, which is a sort of for age 9 to 13. And I sort of described it as the ingredients that go into the blender are a true crime podcast, because I was sitting on a bus going through London listening to a true crime podcast. And it's actually something that I remembered about a baby, I think it's in the 90s maybe, being taken from a maternity ward. And the baby was found okay afterwards. But I thought, what if you're now a teenager and you were that baby and your mum is going to be so protective? What do you do? How do you get over that? Then I thought, what if you're a boy and you're quite happy and you know your family, but you know you have a forbidden grandma who once stole a baby? And what if you're a girl and your mum's quite young and you've never really had anywhere permanent to live? You've lived with friends and other places, but you've finally found somewhere that feels permanent, lodging in a house of a famous artist who has a secret, which you might guess. So 3 different characters who end up all coming together to sort of for this mystery and to solve a sort of mystery. So that one's called People Like Stars, and it's coming out in January. So that's contemporary. And excuse me. And then the third, Elemental Detectives, the fantasy series set in 18th century London. I was interested in going back to the plague and the Great Fire of London, and what if people were creating children as kind of like rat children hybrids. I've been told it might be a bit too much for younger children. But I've got a sort of a guild of variegated assassins who are sort of part human, part animals. So I was trying to work out their origin stories as well. So that's what I'm going to do at the moment.
We've got a question from Walgate School, which is about 8 pieces of silver, but I wonder if we could discuss all your books with this question. When writing, do you have a specific ending in mind?
Yes, actually, I do. The middle I struggle with. Though, so with 8 pieces of silver, probably the one that I didn't, which is weird because that's the one I don't tend to plan much. I usually sort of have lots of do a lot of stuff, work around characters and their motivations, and then work out what they want. I kind of know an ending, and then I've got to work out how to get there. 8 pieces of silver, I actually wanted to write a detective novel, And so I really wanted to have 8 clues, and I knew what they were. But then I did actually struggle with the ending. Though part of it was because it was around 2020, and I think my mind was full of so many other things at the time, pandemic and Black Lives Matters and all of those. So there's a real mishmash going on in my head. And then actually, I can tell you, if you ask me specifically about 8 Pieces of Silver, what happened with the ending is one of those random things again, is that I was getting my hair was longer and I was getting my hair plaited. And it was a Nigerian hairdresser who was plaiting my hair, and she was really upset because all her children had been born in the UK, and she'd gone over to see her partner who'd moved back to Nigeria with her 3 children, and then she was told that she wasn't allowed to bring 2 of her daughters back to England because they weren't considered British citizens, even though they were born in the same hospital as my own child. And I was really, really upset about that. So I think that shaped the ending. I felt something about how families can be split up through those sort of residency laws that got nothing to do with babies and children, and how upset. So that really shaped that ending. That was kind of my fury moment, because other than that, it was kind of a detective novel, and I wanted to, what if you were a girl and you were the stalker and all of those things. And then my moment of fury came in at the end of that, and I think that helped that. But normally I have a destination and a beginning, but the map can take you via Mordor, anywhere.
You touched on detective fiction a few times there, another one from Walgate School, and then we've got several from 5 Acres, which are all looking great. What is your favourite genre to read? You talked about that a little bit, but or what is the easiest genre to write?
Oh, I don't think any genre is easy to write. But some require a lot more research than others. They actually all require sort of research. So for writing the 18th century historical books, that was just a lot of research. Everything about what would have for breakfast, and and all of those things. If you had a hot drink, what would it be? And so they take a long time. So I've got books and books, looking at maps of 18th century London, which bridges were there, all of those things, what buildings. So they take a really long time just because of that. And because I'm a nerd, I sometimes just get really bogged down in research I don't need, because I just find it really interesting, I think. So, but I love writing those books because I am a nerd and I'm really interested in that history. And I can't write anything that I'm not interested in. I couldn't write to think, there's a gap in the market, let me fill it, because that just would not interest me. So I mentor other things that I feel passionate about, and that's my nerdery around history, nerdery around pop culture, and sort of social justice issues as well. So none's easier than other, which is fine. I like to challenge myself as well by doing something different, to know that I can do it and to keep the job interesting for me.
So 5 Acres High School would love to know, are you going to be writing another Gothic book in future? And they would also like to know, do you believe in the supernatural?
I would write a Gothic book. I'd really love to know you said that. I really would. I'm just scared that I would do something that's too cliched. I'd have to think about how would I bring my own, touch to it. I've read a few middle grade Gothic books, which are great, and but I just want to know how I could do something different, I suppose. But I love reading Gothic books. Do I believe in the supernatural? I don't know, actually. One of the things I loved when I used to go to Trinidad was my aunties telling me, some of the stories about, very matter of fact, well, there was a poltergeist and they threw stones on the roof and we were children. So, they brought the Obeah man along to deal with it. Or my auntie saw a ghost by the mango tree. And my mother, when she was she was a nurse in a psychiatric hospital that had been built in Victorian times. So it's really one of those big red brick buildings. And she says that she's seen a couple of ghosts there as well. And it's kind of very matter of fact. So I'm easy both ways. I don't disbelieve. I don't believe, but I'd like to believe, I think. Just because who knows what our world is, really? Who knows? So I'd love to believe. I'm not a disbeliever.
So I'm conscious we've got about 4 questions from 5 Acres to get through. I think probably if you've got one last question, we can take that, but I think we're going to have to stick with the ones we've got, really. So a great question is, what is your favourite book that you've written?
That was Is That Your Mama? I think I mentioned that one earlier, so yeah.
5 Acres High School was your adaptation of Jane Eyre. Was it for an age group than the classic?
It was a very specific brief to make it accessible for age 10 and above, I think. So I mean, I don't know, because I suppose, when Jane Eyre was written, nobody had, there wasn't YA or middle grade or anything like that. So anybody read what they were capable of reading, really. I just think because the original does go off on these big debates sometimes, which I didn't necessarily find that interesting. I mean, there's nothing in it that anybody couldn't read. I think it's just perhaps it's kind of a bit daunting because the size of it and some of the language of it, really. But I think anybody could read it if they've got the time and the patience, I think, to wade through the 400 pages.
I think that starts to answer the question, which probably also got covered a little bit earlier in the call, which was also from 5 Acres. Why did you want to rewrite Jane Eyre? You've answered that. So another question from the same school: do you base your books on unrealistic events?
Unrealistic. Yeah. So that was why I wanted to write the fantasy ones, so I could be totally unrealistic. So the first Elemental Detectives, you've got Jonathan Strong, Robert Strong, who's inspired by actually a real life young man called Jonathan Strong, who was an enslaved young man brought to Barbados, from Barbados to London in the 18th century, treated incredibly badly, and then ended up in Bart's Hospital in London, where he met, oh gosh, I can't remember his name now. Well, two men who became abolitionists, and they became very sort of famous, and Jonathan became forgotten. So I wanted to give him a voice, and I made him into sort of Robert Strong. And Maricy Blackwell, whose grandma is a keeper of London's wells. So every Friday she drops into the wells, talks to the river spirits who complain about how dirty the rivers are, and she takes their complaints to the Lord Mayor of London. So I wanted to create a magical London. And in the first one, you've got the Enchanted Sleep, but the Enchanted Sleep is only the poor people sleep, because they have amazing dreams. And why would you wake up if you're going to be cold and hungry? But if you sleep, you wither away. So they've got to solve the mystery of that. So you've got like the Foundling Hospital and all of these, And in the second one, I thought, what would happen if London lost all its music? If like a rogue air spirit blew all the music away from London? And what if there was a creature, a monster that was sleeping on the Greenwich Peninsula, that slept because of the lullaby of London? And when the music went, the monster rises out of the river and tramples across Covent Garden and everywhere. So yeah, and so for me, writing the fantasies were just a chance to write really unrealistic things, but also still injecting a bit around social justice and poverty and all of those there. But they're great fun to create fantasy monsters, like plague monsters that live in a serpentine, absorb all London's plagues, and ghosts that are a bit angry. So yeah.
Final question now then. Why do you love being a storyteller, and do you have any advice for the young people on the call or your younger self around success or achievements?
I think going back, it depends what you consider success and achievement, to be honest. And I think it's sometimes tempting as a writer to, you see lots of announcements about, this writer has got a massive amount of money and this one's just been offered that. And that's a very small percentage of people. So for me, I write I will always write whether I'm published or not, because that's what brings me joy. And I think that's who I am. I get to lie for a living and get paid for it. Also for me, being somebody from a working class background, someone who is fostered, some from a Caribbean background, growing up, there's never people like me around. So one of the things that I can do is go into schools and say, this is me, people like us, who we can be writers, we can be authors, we can do these, we can do this. And also, for instance, being a book trust writer in residence at the moment, it helps me again around social justice and to be able to talk about those things that I'm passionate about. So for advice for writers, I think write because you're passionate about it, write about the things that you're passionate about. Secondly, are those who's not great on a schools event, but the writing that you do for schools to pass SATs or pass exams isn't necessarily your writing. When you write for yourself, you write stories, you find your own voice, use what's around you, the people around you. Don't pretend to be someone else, be you, because your own voice is absolutely unique and just yours and individual. And it's as important as everybody else's. And I think last thing, if you're serious about being a writer, then look for some of the competitions that they have for young people, children, young people. So National Literary Trust has Wicked competition, the Young Muslims Writers Awards from young Muslim writers. trying to think of some, the BBC, so the BBC have the 500 words, and then they had the one above that, which I think is called Emerging Writers maybe 14 to 17. There might be, if you're a first story school, the charity First Stories in your schools, they have lots of competitions and anthologies and residentials as well. And lastly, when you're writing for yourself, don't worry about your spelling. That's what technology is there for. Don't worry about that side of things, because writing can be anything. So read a lot as well. Read verse novels, read graphic novels, listen to audiobooks. Just get that rhythm, because it's all storytelling.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Patrice. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for, but lots of fabulous insights, and thank you to all the schools who've asked so many brilliant questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Patrice. And thank you to everyone. Loads of questions and some great ones there in the mix. Huge thank you for tuning in today. So a feedback form will be shared with you soon via email, and we'd really appreciate everyone completing that. You could also share some comments before you leave the webpage today. Just click on the poll function on the Q&A chat box under the stream. We would love for you to join us for our next book club next term, where our hero read is Cuts Both Ways by Candice Brathwaite, and our curriculum link is Romeo and Juliet. We'll be joined by Candice and 5 other speakers from the 22nd of January 2025 until the 26th of March, and those sessions are all on screen now. Please do head to our website for more information and to register your groups, or scan the QR codes when we get to our next slide. And you can also find more broadcasts and career-related talks on the Speakers for Schools website. Thank you so much for joining us for this session and for our hero read, Jane Eyre Abridged by Patrice Lawrence. We hope you have enjoyed it as much as we have. We'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thanks, everybody.